This video is going to discuss Orientalism, imperialism, specifically American imperialism, colonialism in the United States during the 1950s, and I'm going to use The King and I by Rogers and Hammerstein as my example to really ground these three terms within a political and historical context. So before I move on, I do want to define some of these terms because I do recognize that some of these terms are problematic or might seem like dirty words. And the first one would be the term Orientalism. And this is directly referring to the term Oriental. So Oriental is an umbrella term or generic term for anything that is Asian. It was used a lot until more recently when we became aware of that term as being problematic, as it not really representing Asia. And there are plenty of examples of Orientalism that I'm not going to get into, but any movie that you see that is Asian but is not a specific Asian country or is borrowing from many different themes, Mulan, that's an Orientalist movie. Even if that wasn't the intention, that's what happened. So that's really what I mean. For the United States' context, it's really our appropriating Asian culture or our misunderstanding a lot of what is actually going on in Asian culture. So that's really all it is. It's not negative. I mean, it's negative, but I'm using it in term like Orientalism. It's not. Or Orientalism is the scholarly term for talking about the tradition or the culture of Orientalism in the United States, the way in which we have adopted or appropriated different Asian influences that should become Orientalist in the United States. So the term Oriental comes from the word Orient, which is merely the way in which we perceive the world. So if we were to look at a map of the world, not the sphere, thinking of it as a map, we can divide the world into somewhere down that middle of a typical Eurocentric map. And what we're going to end up with is two different sides of the world. One is the East, the other is the West. So the East is derived from the Latin word Orient, which means rising, and that's merely referring to the east and that the sun rises in the east. And then the west side is referred to as the Latin word occident, which just means fall, or in the west where the sun sets. That's all these words mean. They've just been derived and used in a different way. So that's really all these are. Now, what's complicated is if we rethink our worldview and we think more of the world as being a sphere, which is how it's actually shaped, it's not flat, dividing the world between West and East is very complicated. For one, the more you go east, you're going to eventually end up in the West again because the world is round. So it really, dividing the world West to East, it's merely really based on a Eurocentric worldview where these divisions perhaps exist. So you're othering the East, incidentally. What also happens when you try to make a line through the world is it's not a very straight line. You can't, because also in the East you end up with Australia and New Zealand if you're thinking of it in this way. So what ends up happening is you end up with kind of a weird line that goes through the world. It's kind of fuzzy. There are certain countries like Turkey who feel like they're Western, even though they're definitely belonging in the East when we draw the line through it. So this is where it gets quite complicated. My next term is colonialism. And colonialism and imperialism are very different, but they're also going to be used in many ways in this video as being pretty similar, at least in the way we think of it in the 1950s. So colonialism is the practice of acquiring a full or partial political control of another country. Now, there is always a power imbalance between the two. Military-wise, economic-wise, and then there's always the taking advantage of that other country you were occupying in some way. So you occupy it with settlers, you exploit the land, you take from its economy, and what you're also trying to do is apply your own culture to that nation. You're basically just taking it over in that way. Imperialism is different. Instead of occupying with settlers, imperialism is extending a country's power through diplomatic or military force. With imperialism, power imbalances are a little different. It's really who wins the war or happens to win like diplomatically who ends up coming out ahead. But colonialism, there is a clear power imbalance, and there's also a mindset of you believe that you, by going to another country, that you are making their lives better, even though you're not. Generally, you're usually not. But that's how colonialism works. So when we're talking about American imperialism and colonialism, in this video, we're going to be talking about the 1860s, which is when the King and I is set, and that's going to be referring to British colonialism in Southeast Asia. Now, we're also going to be talking about American imperialism in the 1950s, which is when the musical was actually written. My next part we need to talk about is the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, was already beginning in the 1950s when this musical was written. It's fairly recent in the sense that you have to understand we had only just dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and that was really what started to begin the Cold War. And so it's relatively new by this point. But understanding that the Cold War is a global war, and a lot of it was within the United States was a domestic war. It was a way in which to exacerbate fears of a global atomic war within our own culture. So there was a widespread fear. At the same time, the United States, especially like not so much in the 1950s, it was beginning, but 1960s for sure, and then the 1970s, the U.S. intervening in foreign governments. And what our excuse becomes, which we'll talk later in the video, is preventing communism, which really one of the ways in which we use that preventing communism or preventing the spread of communism becomes a form of justifying our intervention in another country. That we're saying, oh, but we're preventing the spread of communism, where we're also wishing to spread the power of the United States globally. So there are always more motivations than just the obvious one. So therefore, the purpose of this video essay is going to look at these major themes of Orientalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and then finally the culture of the Cold War within The King and I, and how in which Rogers and Hammerstein participate in this culture of fear in Orientalism. And therefore, I'm not going to sit here and point out all the reasons why The King and I is racist or is problematic. Because yes, it was written in the 1950s. It's racist at times. It's problematic at times. So sitting here and just pointing out all the reasons why it's problematic is reductionist. Because here's the thing. One, someone else has already done that. Many people have already done that. Anyone who tries to adapt The King and I for modern audiences or contemporary productions of The King and I already have to make some of these choices. So issues of yellowface I can talk about from the 1950s. Well, we avoid using yellowface today. We try to actually cast Asian actors for these roles. So it is reductionist. I'll give it that. And the fact that even though Rogers and Hammerstein wrote pretty problematic musical at times, the source material they are taking from was problematic in its own right. So a lot of what you end up with in The King and I is just merely derived from the source material. So The King and I is based loosely on a true story. It was Anne Leonowens, who was a governess in the 1860s. So this story is based on her memoirs. She was a governess who was invited by King Mongkut to come to his harem, to come to his court, and teach his children, or all the children whose mothers are in right with the king, are in good favor with the king. She's supposed to come and teach them, and then also teach his wives. So these memoirs were adapted into a novel in the 1940s by Margaret Landon, and this is known as the Anna and the King of Siam. This novel is where a lot of the problematic language that we see in The King and I becomes explicit. which I'll talk more about that later. But that's where a lot of the issues of the derived language, and then this novel, which is a very loose narrative. It's a very episodic. In this sense, it's just a lot of like short episodes, not a lot of interlocking stories. It's not easy to make into a cohesive musical, which is why Rodgers and Hammerstein were a little, historically, a little worried about adapting such a musical. But then the film, which is based on the novel, corrects a lot of these issues of narrative and makes it more one cohesive whole. And once again, a lot of what happens in the novel has in the film as well. So issues of narrative with the king, the way the king talks, the Orientalist, any sort of Orientalisms we have in The King and I. So The King and I then is derived from the film and the novel. And some influence from the memoirs, but its primary source material is the novel and the film. So what we are going to see then is a lot of the racist or problematic issues within The King and I are just participating in the already existing story of Anna and the King of Siam. So for the next part of this video, we're going to talk about these brief changes in the musical that we're attempting to correct some of the racist undertones in the original novel and film. The King and I is set in Siam, which is modern-day Thailand. Siam is an interesting case because it becomes the only Southeast Asian nation to never be formally colonized, as in it is never formally occupied by another nation. At least by another Western nation. Now that gets complicated with other East Asian nations like China, which were occupying other East Asian nations. So that's where that narrative becomes a little complicated. So one of the ways we see this narrative take place in The King and I is with King Mongkut, who historically was also participating in his own westernization. And one of the ways in which this is exploited in the musical is to show that he wanted his nation to be westernized. But what's actually happening and why he was actually westernizing his nation was because if he made his nation look like they were not barbarians, like they were cultured people, like they were just other Westerners, they could avoid colonization by the British. So that's really what we end up seeing in The King and I, is even though it's a messy portrayal within the actual context of the musical, this is what's actually taking place historically. King Mongkut is avoiding colonization within his nation by participating in his own westernization. So that's why Anna is brought in to Siam to teach his children, because his intention is for her to teach his children English and to teach them the ways of European values is really what the goal is. Now, the musical adapts and makes several different changes from the historical King Mongkut and Anna, and also the source material it's based on, which is the Margaret Landon's book and the film based on her novel. So there are several major changes. The first is the King and Anna. And this has changed throughout time in more modern productions, but where there were hints in the memoirs of a possible romance between the king and Anna, at least a flirtatious one, where they maybe had mutual feelings for each other, this is largely taken out in the musical because Rodgers and Hammerstein agreed that 1950s audiences wouldn't like this relationship, that it would be a biracial relationship, and they recognize okay, our audiences are not going to like this. Now, this is one of the major changes that is made in modern productions, where the relationship between the king and Anna is made more explicit, that they clearly do like each other. It's made more explicit than just what we see in the song Shall We Dance, where then the king and Anna dance together. It's made much more explicit throughout the actual musical in today's productions. So that's where you might be a little confused by this, but in the original production, very minimal signs of their relationship, if any. What happens instead is Tuptim, Queen Tuptim, who is one of King Mongkut's junior wives, is in a secret relationship with her lover. In different versions, it depends on who he is. Some versions he's a priest, some he's just a scholar. So that really depends. In this version, he's a scholar. They're in love, and one of the reasons why Rogers and Hammerstein have Tuptim and her lover be the main romance is to have a lovers duets throughout. So one of the major differences from the novel is the fate of Tuptim. So in the novel, Tuptim and her lover are tortured and then killed by the king in front of Anna, despite Anna spending a lot of time protesting and telling the king, no, this isn't right, you should let her go, especially since there's hints of her being a slave or not wanting to be his wife. And so Anna's very vocal about that, but in the novel, she fails ultimately. The king does not listen to her. In the musical, that's the major difference, or one of the major differences is the fate of Tuptim. So her lover is found dead in the musical. Doesn't really say who killed him, but it's hinted that it was still the king, that he was involved in some way. And Tuptim is going to be tortured, or she's going to be whipped by the king. And Anna is there, and she's telling him, please don't do this. Don't do this. You're better than this. Don't do this. This is not the Western way. And he puts the whip down and he leaves. He runs away. And so that's a major change in the fate of Tuptim. Now, what's a little difficult in the musical is the fate of Tuptim is left pretty ambiguous, because when she's pulled away to go be imprisoned, she's saying that she'll kill herself. So we do not actually know what happens to Tuptim, but she is not killed in front of Anna, at least. In real life, the king is very intelligent. He would have been multilingual. He was participating in his westernization, understood the implications of being westernized, but he was doing it for the sake of his kingdom. So a lot of the intelligence of the historical King Mongkut is removed, and he is instead becomes a caricature of what Westerners perceive as East Asian men, specifically an East Asian king. So in the novel, which Rogers and Hammerstein borrow Landon's version of the king, he is childish, he's bombastic, he's a mere caricature of himself. He repeats words, he talks in broken English, which nothing wrong with that, and many of the wives do talk in broken English and absolutely would have. But the king would have been fluent in English and would have spoken to Anna in a very fluent way. And so the way in which he is portrayed in the musical is quite inaccurate from the actual King Mongkut, but it's just borrowing from what Landon already did. A lot of the dialogue that you see in the musical is taken right from Landon's novel. So anything that's problematic about the king was already created by Margaret Landon and is just adopted by Rogers and Hammerstein. The next major difference, and really the major difference, is in real life, Anna takes a 6-month leave from Siam to go visit her daughter in England. While she's gone, the king dies. And in real life, Anna never returns to Siam, but remains in contact with her eldest pupil and new king for the rest of her life. In the musical, the king dies on stage. Anna is there, and she's with him when he dies. And from there, the musical ends with the new king, his eldest son, becoming king. So it also hints at this old ruler to new ruler, one who has been westernized for much of his life. So it kind of hints at a new Siam, perhaps, is how the musical ends. Still a pretty ambiguous ending in that sense, if you don't know much about history. And so a lot of what we see, the Orientalisms and the problematic narrative in The King and I, is taken from already existing source material. So the major part of the Orientalism that is directly created by Rogers specifically is in the music. So Rogers decides not to use actual Thai music. He decides not to borrow from their melodies, to not even try to invoke what their music actually sounds like. Because what he decided ultimately is the music would not be accessible for American audiences. So instead, he just writes Oriental sounding music, Asian sounding music. So he uses open fifths, pentatonic scales, ways in which to make something sound Asian or Oriental without actually deriving itself from real Asian musical practices. Just taking the ways in which we as Westerners perceive their music. And so Western audiences, when they hear this, will automatically think, oh yeah, that sounds very Oriental, but will also understand it because it is still a Western perception of Asian music. So in the next section, I am going to look more deeply at the motivations behind American imperialism in the 1950s and the way in which that would have influenced The King and I. So by doing that, I am going to look at 3 specific examples in The King and I's plot and discuss how it relates to American imperialism and the culture of the Cold War. In the 1950s, this was a time post-World War II and the very beginning of the Cold War when the United States was beginning to intervene in other countries, specifically to prevent the spread of communism. Now, as I stated earlier in this video, that becomes one of the ways in which the United States justifies its own occupying and colonizing other nations. Its own involvement in the Vietnam War, for instance, is used as an excuse to stop communism, even though that becomes far more complex. So it becomes a way in which to justify colonialism. Now, this is a way to recognize that the United States not only is preventing to stop communism, it is also preventing colonialism. Especially within the context of Vietnam, another Southeast Asian nation, we were there after the French had stopped their occupation of Indochina, which was Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Now, that was one of the ways in which we believe, due to France's occupation in Vietnam, that they ultimately caused the Vietnam War. So not only we're anti-colonialism in many ways, at the same time, we are using our own motivations to justify colonialism and justify American imperialism. Remembering that there are slight differences between colonialism and imperialism. So this is also a period of time where Orientalism becomes far more prominent, where the United States is getting exposed more and more to East Asian culture. And so what we see then within The King and I is this incidental these incidental traditions coming in to Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical. So there are several of them. There are 3 different ones that I want to talk about, and these are all some of the most important moments in the in the musical. So the first one is, this is one of the scenes that is used most often in scholarship, and it's used for several different reasons. So in this part of the musical, Anna is teaching the children and the other wives a map of the world. And the first one she shows is a more East Asian centric perception of the world, where Siam looks fairly big, especially in relationship to Burma, for instance. And that is the Siam worldview. Now, Anna pulls down a new map, depending upon the version, and it's a Eurocentric map, and it's a map that the audience watching The King and I would have been familiar with. And in this map, decenters Asia and instead focuses on Europe as being more the center, and Siam looks incredibly small. Like, she has to point it out to them that that's their country. And the children, especially the eldest son, are very upset by it. They protest and they say that can't be right. And what Anna does, instead of telling them that they're wrong, she points out where England is on the map, and England is even smaller than Siam. And in this way of doing this is a way in which a cultural sharing between Anna and the children. And it's one of those moments during the musical where there's an actual exchange between them. And so this this example of the map of the world becomes a way in which to talk about geography, a way to talk about world perceptions between a Westerner's point of view and an Easterner's point of view. But what I like to use it is an example of cultural exchange between the two, of Anna sharing, like, look, my country's also small. So what she's really saying is the size of the nation doesn't matter. It's all based upon economic value and military. So we can say that as being an equal exchange between the two, but really this is also a period of British imperialism. So even though Great Britain, or England, is relatively small, they still have the power to colonize countries in Southeast Asia. So this becomes a somewhat problematic narrative in there. That while this is if you look at it pretty simply, this is a nice exchange between Anna and the children. The second one is Mongkut's own westernization, and this happens throughout the musical. Before the musical begins, Mongkut is already wanting to westernize. It's not something that Anna causes, but what Anna becomes, she becomes a symbol of British imperialism, and therefore in the 1950s, she becomes an example of American imperialism. She is someone that contemporary audiences can immediately connect with. She speaks in a familiar way. She dresses in what we perceive as being 19th century way of dressing. And so some of what happens is Anna helps save Mongkut from former colonization, which fits in the narrative of the United States being anti-colonial, not liking colonialism, not liking the idea of another nation taking over another. So in this way, says that Anna is saving them by westernizing them. So this becomes actually a pretty difficult or problematic narrative, that he's participating in their own westernization to protect themselves from British colonizers, and Anna becomes an important part in this role. At the same time, she does some things in the musical that almost ruin things. For one, when the British people are coming to see Siam, she has the wives put on a play, and it's a play based on Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in real life, Anna was very anti-slavery, and so that was one of the ways in which she was showing, like, these wives who many of them feel like they're slaves, like they are prisoners in their own home. So that's actually one of the ways in which I think Anna was almost manipulating the situation, was trying to challenge the king, who has 100 wives, and one of the ways she was attempting to challenge his worldview. And so that's one of the ways in which Anna challenges what their role in being westernized. The last one is the fate of Tuptim, which I've already talked about. Anna did have actual influence in the musical from Tuptim for the fate of Tuptim. She does not actually die. So Anna becomes important in this role of saving Tuptim and protecting the overall Western legacy in Siam, that she is eventually, she's successful. But this is also difficult because Tuptim's actual fate is left ambiguous. It's actually left pretty ambiguous. So what ends up happening is we don't know really, and it actually goes with the fact that we don't actually know the fate of Siam after the musical ends. So in my closing, I didn't want to just go through and talk about reasons why this musical is problematic, because it honestly would have been a waste of time to do so. So instead, I wanted to go through specific examples and discuss in ways in which the musical participates in this tradition and culture in the United States of Orientalism and of fear of the Cold War. The King and I is a part of that narrative. it doesn't matter if you're thinking of it from an 1860s British imperial view, or if you're thinking it from the view of American imperialism in the 1950s. The musical is both based on historical events and is also participating in actual world view. So I know that I didn't completely cover everything in the musical, and so I really challenge you to go watch the musical, since I didn't really talk about plot all that much. I recommend to go watch the musical, watch the movie from the 1950s, and then watch a newer production of it, and so you can see some of these differences. And then finally, I want you to look at my sources that I have included in the description to this video, because some of these are considered foundational works. If you have more questions about the term Orientalism, or you're wanting to know more about American imperialism, I recommend checking out these works. So thank you for listening.